Two little twin girls hold a loaf of bread at the grocery store counter and say to the cashier, "Can we pay later? Our mummy is really sick at home." A young millionaire behind them hears everything and does something nobody expected. The door chime jingled as Dylan Carter stepped into the small neighborhood grocery store. The old air conditioner barely coped with the morning heat, creating that warm atmosphere typical of family-run establishments. Dylan adjusted the sleeve of his dark suit, feeling immediately out of place among the modest shelves and linoleum floor. The man behind the counter continued arranging products without looking up. Dylan grabbed a shopping basket and disappeared between the aisles, grateful for the lack of attention. He rarely came to this part of the city. His penthouse at the Pinnacle was only a few blocks away, yet it felt like an entirely different world. He walked through the narrow aisles without a clear purpose, picking up random items. A single apple, a chocolate bar, some random magazine. The cheap scent of cleaning products mixed with the aroma of fresh bread, creating a strangely comforting combination. He was about to head to the cashier when the door jingled again. Two little girls entered the store, identical, with the same dark hair tied in messy braids and simple, worn-out dresses. Twins, Dylan realized. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old. There was something about their posture, a mix of determination and nervousness that caught his attention. The small twins moved quickly through the store and grabbed a single loaf of bread, holding it carefully as if it were something precious. They went straight to the counter, exchanging looks that seemed to contain an entire silent conversation. Dylan stayed between the shelves, inexplicably interested in that small everyday scene. "Good morning," said the store owner, looking at the girls with a neutral expression. "Good morning, sir," they replied in unison, their voices small but clear. "Just the bread today." One of them nodded, while the other placed the merchandise on the counter. The man punched the price into the cash register. "That's $3.25. The twins exchanged another glance, and then the one who seemed slightly more confident took a step forward. "Can we pay later? Our mommy is very sick at home," she said, the words spilling out fast as though they had been rehearsed, but her voice trembled slightly at the end. The store owner paused, his hand suspended over the cash register. His face hardened a bit. "I'm sorry, little ones, but we don't allow tabs," he said, not cruelly, but firmly. "I can't make exceptions." "Please," insisted the other twin, stepping forward to stand beside her sister. "Mommy couldn't get up today and we have nothing to eat." The two girls remained there, holding hands, with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in bodies so small. Dylan felt something strange in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Without thinking twice, he approached the counter. "How much is the bread?" he asked, his voice sounding louder than usual in the tiny establishment. 3 heads turned in his direction, surprised by the interruption. $3.25, the store owner replied. Dylan pulled a $20 bill from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Take care of mine too and keep the change." The twins looked at him with identical expressions of surprise, their wide eyes reflecting a gratitude so genuine that Dylan looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity of that emotion. "Thank you, sir," they exclaimed together, almost in perfect sync. "We'll be able to pay when Mommy gets better." "No need to pay," Dylan replied, surprising even himself. "It's all right." The girls took the bread and hurried out, but not before turning back one last time and waving tentative smiles on their identical faces. "Good deed of the day," the store owner commented as he finished ringing up Dylan's items. Dylan nodded without answering, picking up his own purchases and stepping out into the sunny street. He was supposed to go back to his penthouse, to his scheduled meetings, to the organized life he had built. But his feet went the other way, the direction the twins had taken. He spotted them turning a corner, holding hands, the loaf carefully cradled by one of them. A common, almost insignificant scene, 2 children returning home with food. So why couldn't he look away? "Can we pay later? Our mommy is very sick at home." The phrase echoed in his mind, as if it had some hidden meaning he needed to decipher. There was a quiet bravery in those words, a sense of responsibility children that young shouldn't have to carry. Dylan stopped, letting them walk on. He turned back toward the Pinnacle, his pace slower than usual, His penthouse, once a refuge, felt strangely empty when he closed the door behind him. He dropped the groceries on the counter and walked to the window. From there, he could see part of the city that had seen him born and then leave. To study, to work, to build an empire, and finally to return as a stranger. Somewhere down there, two unknown little twins were heading home with a loaf of bread for their sick mother. Somewhere among those streets, lives were happening, connected to one another in ways Dylan had forgotten how to appreciate. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then called his assistant. "Mark, I need you to find out something." He paused. Two twin girls, around 8 years old, dark hair in braids. They were at the grocery store on Maple Street this morning. They said their mother is sick. I want to know who they are and where they live. He hung up before being questioned about his sudden interest. He wouldn't know how to explain it. How could he say that a simple child's request in a neighborhood store had stirred something he'd been ignoring for years? Dylan sat down on the sofa, feeling the silence of the apartment in a new and uncomfortable way. For a brief moment in that grocery store, he had connected with something beyond himself, with those children's worry, their determination, the simplicity of a problem he could solve with a single bill. Problem solved, case closed. Then why couldn't he stop thinking about those small identical faces, those messy braids, those joined hands? For the first time in a long while, Dylan Carter was curious about someone besides himself. And part of him knew that this casual encounter had planted a seed that would change something in his perfectly controlled life. From the top of the pinnacle penthouse, the city looked like a neat toy, its pieces perfectly fitted. Dylan remained still by the floor-to-ceiling window, a forgotten glass of whiskey in his hand. The amber liquid reflected the sunset as the city's lights began to switch on one by one, like artificial stars. It was a view many would pay fortunes for. In fact, they did. The other floors of the pinnacle housed executives, celebrities, heirs, people Dylan knew by name but rarely by their stories. People like him, or at least, like he used to think he was. His phone vibrated on the coffee table. Dylan ignored it. It was probably Mark, his assistant, with information about the twins. Or one of the lawyers wanting to discuss the new acquisition on the West Coast. Or the restaurant manager, confirming his usual Friday night reservation, a table for one. It could all wait. For the first time in years, Dylan Carter was having a moment of clarity that didn't involve spreadsheets or contracts. He twirled the glass between his fingers, watching the city he had helped shape. Over there was the park he financed 3 years ago, the business complex that revitalized downtown, the old theater he saved from demolition, his legacy in concrete and steel. And somewhere down there, lost among the thousands of lit windows, were two twin girls carrying a loaf of bread to their sick mother. "Can we pay later? Our mommy is very sick at home." The phrase hadn't left him. It followed him like a shadow through the penthouse corridors, echoing in the empty spaces that had never before seemed empty. Dylan scanned the apartment with a critical eye. Everything there had been chosen with surgical precision. Italian-designed furniture, original artworks, imported rugs. The best money could buy. Each object told the story of a successful man. But none told the story of Dylan Carter, the man behind the business, behind the fortune. There was something strangely impersonal about the perfection of the environment, like a set, a magazine photo instead of a home. Dylan noticed, with uncomfortable clarity, the absence of the small details that make a space feel lived in. There were no books half-read with bookmarks, no forgotten coffee mugs, no personal photos. Even the mail was perfectly organized in a tray by the door, untouched. He sat on the sofa that cost more than a luxury car and that, ironically, had never received visitors. The softness of the Italian fabric was a jarring contrast to the memory of the twins' worn-out dresses. Thinking about those girls stirred up a strange sensation. It wasn't exactly pity. There was too much dignity in the way they carried themselves for pity. It was more like curiosity, maybe even admiration, for the courage to ask for help, for the responsibility they took on so young, for the obvious bond between them. Bond. The word resonated in his mind like a dissonant note. When was the last time he felt a genuine bond with anyone? Not the transactional relationships that dominated his days, with partners, employees, occasional lovers who vanished before breakfast. A real connection, selfless, like what he had seen between those children, probably before he became Dylan Carter, the name that appeared in business magazines and billionaire lists. When he was just Dylan, the ambitious boy from a small town, determined to prove his worth. Back then, there were people in his life, real people, not contacts in an electronic agenda or names on contracts. The phone vibrated again. This time, Dylan picked it up. A message from Mark. Found info about the twins, Sophie and Lila Thompson, 8 years old. Live in an apartment at 476 Elm Street. Single mother Clara Thompson diagnosed with... Dylan didn't need to read the rest. Now the girls had names, Sophie and Lila, and an address, a story forming. He placed the phone back on the table, restless. What did he intend to do with this information? Why did he care? A simple act of casual charity was one thing, paying for bread, leaving a generous tip, making anonymous donations. But this persistent interest was different, uncomfortably different. He walked over to the bar and refilled his glass. The drink went down warm, familiar, without offering the usual comfort. The city was still there, bright and indifferent, separated from him by tempered glass and altitude. Dylan had spent years building that barrier, brick by brick, deal by deal, floor by floor. Now, for the first time, he felt imprisoned by it. He looked around at the vastness of the apartment that echoed with his solitude. Everything was exactly as he had planned. Perfect. Controlled, empty. Can we pay later? The twins' words had a humility that Dylan recognized from his own past, before success, before money. A humility he had forgotten, buried under layers of accomplishments and acquisitions. Those girls had something all his money couldn't buy. They had each other, and a mother they cared about so much that they endured the shame of asking. Dylan went back to the window, searching the urban landscape for some answer to the unease growing in his chest. The city, as always, remained beautiful and distant, like a lover who never fully surrenders. 5 years ago, he returned to this city like a conqueror, determined to leave his mark. And he had. His mark was there in the buildings he constructed, in the businesses he established, but something was missing. A puzzle piece he was only now realizing he'd lost. Maybe the true legacy wasn't in buildings or bank accounts. Maybe it was in simpler connections, like the trust between two sisters, the genuine look of gratitude, the small gesture of helping strangers. A dry laugh escaped his lips. He was becoming philosophical over a loaf of bread, a single loaf costing $3.25. But it wasn't about the bread, he realized. It was about the request, about the vulnerability of needing and the courage of asking. It was about connection, about human need, something he had forgotten how to feel long ago. Dylan finished his drink and placed the glass on the coffee table with sudden resolve. Tomorrow he would go to 476 Elm Street, not to interfere or intrude, just to observe, to understand. Why? He couldn't explain. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, he felt something beyond the controlled boredom that dominated his days. Or maybe because he had glimpsed, in that brief meeting at the grocery store, something his glass and steel empire could never provide. From the perfect penthouse overlooking the city he had conquered, Dylan Carter finally admitted to himself he had built a whole world of things, but none of them was home. The grocery store looked different in the morning, busier, more real. Dylan adjusted his sunglasses and pushed open the door, making the chime jingle as it had the day before. This time, though, he wasn't wearing a pristine suit, but jeans and a simple shirt, an awkward attempt to look... what? Normal? Less intimidating. A different clerk than the day before was stocking products on the shelves. Dylan walked up to the counter, trying to appear casual. "Good morning," he greeted. "I was here yesterday and saw 2 girls. Twins. They bought a loaf of bread." The man frowned, confused. "Sorry, sir, I started my shift today. No idea who you're talking about." Dylan tried again. 2 identical little girls, about 8 years old, dark hair in braids. The clerk shrugged. Lots of kids come in and out. I don't really notice. Dylan thanked him and bought a bottle of water he didn't need. Frustration grew inside him, an unusual feeling for someone used to immediate answers. At the counter, he hesitated. The employee from yesterday, what time does he come back? Mr. Myers, not until tomorrow. The man replied, storing the money in the cash register. Dylan nodded and left, feeling the morning sun on his face. He had an address, 476 Elm Street, but he wanted more than that. He wanted context, to see the world those girls lived in before simply showing up there. He decided to walk, to explore the streets of the city he had transformed with his investments, but rarely experienced up close. The sidewalks changed as he moved on without a set destination. The polished marble facades of upscale shops gave way to cracked concrete. Trendy cafes with outdoor seating were replaced by small eateries with plastic menus in the windows. The streets grew narrower, more crowded. Dylan passed unnoticed here, just another man walking on a Thursday morning. He was used to being noticed, to having doors opened for him, to receiving practiced smiles of perfection. Invisibility was a strangely liberating sensation. On the corner, a man played saxophone, his open case at his feet, holding a few scattered coins. The improvised melody floated in the air, lulling the morning with its melancholic notes. Dylan stopped to listen, letting the music seep into places long silenced within him. When the saxophonist finished the song, Dylan placed a $20 bill in the case. The man nodded in thanks, with no clue who his anonymous benefactor was. A pure gesture, with no expectation of recognition, unlike the substantial donations Dylan regularly made to institutions that put his name on gold plaques. He kept walking aimlessly, now more attentive to the city's details, the city he had helped shape, but rarely truly witnessed. A florist arranged buckets of flowers on the sidewalk, filling the air with sweet fragrances. A group of students laughed loudly outside a diner. An elderly couple strolled slowly, hand in hand, completely absorbed in each other. This bustling, vibrant, and imperfect city carried on every day while he watched from afar, from above, separated by glass and privilege. He passed an elementary school, the empty playground indicating classes were in session. Was that where the twins studied? Children in matching uniforms could be seen through classroom windows, small figures absorbed in lessons that would shape their futures. Dylan had never thought much about public education before. It was just another line in his taxes, another item on his annual charitable donations. Now, though, he looked at the modest building and saw lives being formed, opportunities being created or denied. In a small park nearby, he sat on a bench, watching a mother push a stroller while talking on her phone. The domesticity of the scene hit him unexpectedly hard. Ordinary lives connected, interdependent, so different from the isolated existence he had built for himself. He took out his phone, checked the accumulating emails, meetings cancelled without explanation, contracts pending his signature, decisions awaiting his verdict. The Carter Empire didn't stop, even when its founder decided to take an unscheduled walk through unfamiliar neighborhoods. With a few taps, he postponed the meetings to the following week and delegated decisions to capable subordinates. He was making room for what he still didn't know exactly. He stood up and kept walking, letting intuition guide him through ever more unfamiliar streets. Searching for two unknown children in an entire city was absurd. He knew that, but he couldn't go back to the empty penthouse. Not yet. He turned a corner and spotted a small playground nestled between two older apartment buildings, swings, a slide, a sandbox. Empty at this time of day with the kids in school. School, of course. The twins would be at school right now. Dylan sat on another bench, feeling simultaneously relieved and disappointed. What would he have done if he had found them? What would he say? "Hello, I'm the rich guy who paid for your bread yesterday and now I'm following you." The idea was absurd. Even so, he couldn't leave. A sign nearby read Elm Street on the corner. Coincidence? Or had his subconscious led him here? He looked at the building numbers. He was close, he realized. The housing complex at 476 Elm Street must be one of those faded red brick buildings lining the street. Built decades before the real estate boom Dylan had helped fuel, they weren't rundown but bore the weight of years, and deferred maintenance. Windows with makeshift curtains, potted plants trying to add life to small balconies, clothes hanging to dry on improvised lines, lives happening, imperfect, struggling, persisting. Dylan watched the people coming and going, an elderly man walking a small dog, a teenage girl with headphones, a delivery guy carrying packages. All part of a social fabric from which he, in his glass tower, had completely isolated himself. He remembered the twins, their identical faces, the silent determination in their posture. "Can we pay later? Our mommy is very sick at home." It wasn't just about a loaf of bread, he realized. It was about connection, about responsibility, about belonging to something bigger than oneself, things he had forgotten, or maybe never truly understood, in his quest for success and control. As he stood up to continue his improvised search, he felt lighter, as if he were descending from an invisible tower he had built around himself. The city he had always viewed as a collection of properties and business opportunities now revealed itself as a living, breathing organism. Not a conquest to be admired from afar, but a place to be inhabited, experienced, shared. Dylan Carter, the man who had built his empire by going ever higher, now discovered that what he truly sought might be at ground level, in the streets, in the chance encounters he had ignored for so long. He kept walking, without a clear destination, but for the first time in years, he felt truly present in the world he had helped create. The afternoon sun was starting to wane when Dylan turned onto a street of modest houses set back from the main avenues. He had been walking for hours, stopping only for a quick sandwich at a corner diner where no one recognized him. The improbable search for two girls in an entire city felt increasingly absurd, but something prevented him from giving up. That was when he heard the laughter, a crystalline, carefree sound coming from an alley between two old buildings. Dylan slowed his pace, drawn by the genuine joy in those children's voices. He approached the entrance of the alley cautiously, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. What he saw left him frozen. Sophie and Lila, the twins from the grocery stores, were there, facing away from him, leaning over a large metal dumpster. Their dark hair, still in identical braids, but now more unkempt, swayed as they moved. They wore simple clothes, worn from use but clean. "Found another one of them exclaimed, holding something up Dylan couldn't identify. "Let's see if there's more," said the other, standing on her tiptoes to reach deeper into the dumpster. They were rummaging through trash, but not with desperation or shame. They did it with the naturalness and even joy of children on a treasure hunt, as if there was nothing wrong or sad about that activity. Dylan felt a tightening in his chest. The contrast between the innocence of the laughter and the reality of what they were doing was too painful to watch passively. "Hello," he said, stepping forward. The girls whirled around instantly, startled. Their identical faces registered first shock, then recognition. "It's the bread man," one of them whispered to her sister, without taking her eyes off Dylan. "That's me," he confirmed, trying to smile reassuringly. "Dylan Carter." The twins exchanged glances, as if consulting each other without words. "I'm Sophie," finally said the one who seemed slightly more confident. "This is my sister Lila." "What are you looking for in there?" Dylan asked, keeping some distance so as not to frighten them. Sophie hesitated, but Lila answered with the frankness typical of children. "Aluminum cans. Mr. Jenkins at the recycling place pays 5 cents for each one." Dylan looked more closely and saw a small plastic bag beside them, already containing some crushed cans. They weren't rifling through common garbage, but specifically hunting for recyclables. "Do you find many?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Today, yes," Lila replied excitedly. "Behind the Italian restaurant, there's always a bunch on Thursdays." Sophie watched Dylan with more caution, weighing his intentions. "Do you need something?" she asked, her voice direct and mature far beyond her years. The question, so direct and adult from someone so young, caught Dylan by surprise. What would he say? That he had been looking for them, that he couldn't stop thinking about their request for a single loaf of bread. "Actually," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I was out for a walk and thought I recognized you." The twins exchanged another quick look. "Do you live around here?" Sophie asked, curious. "Not too far." Dylan evaded the details. Do you collect cans often? 3 times a week, Sophie answered with a hint of pride. It's our job. Job, Dylan repeated, surprised by the choice of word. Yes, Lila confirmed. Mommy says everyone has to pitch in. Collecting cans is our part. There was a dignity in those words that touched Dylan deeply. Children so young already understanding the concept of family responsibility, of contributing. A brief silence settled, broken only by the distant sound of traffic. The sun cast long shadows into the alley, signaling the afternoon was winding down. Are you finished here? Dylan finally asked. I can help carry the cans if you like, and maybe give you a ride home afterward. It's getting late. He expected resistance, suspicion. After all, he was a stranger offering a ride to 2 kids. But to his surprise, the twins consulted with yet another silent look before Sophie responded, That's fine. We've collected a lot today anyway. Thank you, sir, added Leela, picking up the bag of cans. Their natural acceptance of his offer unsettled him. There wasn't the distrust you'd expect, and that would be healthy for children dealing with strangers. You shouldn't accept rides from people you barely know, he said, unable to contain his concern. Sophie shrugged, an oddly adult gesture on her small frame. You helped us at the store, and you have kind eyes, she explained, as if it were obvious. Mommy says we can trust people with kind eyes. Dylan felt something crack inside him. The innocence of that logic, the vulnerability it implied. How many people with kind eyes had ill intentions? Well, thank you, he replied, and unable to say more. Shall we go? They walked side by side along the sidewalk, Dylan slowing his long strides to match the little girl's short legs. Lila chattered happily about a drawing she was working on, about how she liked collecting cans because sometimes she found interesting things along the way. Sophie remained quieter, but occasionally added details to her sister's narrative. How's your mum? Dylan asked gently, remembering the phrase he'd heard at the store. You mentioned she was sick. The twins exchanged another quick look before Sophie answered. She gets tired sometimes, she works a lot. But she's better today, Lila added. She smiled at breakfast. Something in the simplicity of that response, measuring their mother's health by a morning smile, struck Dylan deeply. They turned onto an even simpler street, lined with small houses on both sides. Some had well-tended gardens, others had broken fences or old cars parked outside. It wasn't exactly a poor neighborhood, Dylan realized, more like a working-class area where people lived with what they had. That's the one, Lila pointed to a small brick house. It was a narrow townhouse with a tiny porch protected by an old railing. A few plastic potted plants tried to bring life to the limited space, and white curtains covered the small windows. They approached the low gate, and Dylan noticed details that spoke of care despite scarcity. The clean entrance, a worn doormat without stains, a pot with colorful artificial flowers hanging next to the door. Mommy should be home, Sophie commented, opening the gate. She works the morning shift on Thursdays. Dylan nodded, suddenly feeling nervous. What would he say to the girl's mother? How would he explain his presence? He was about to suggest maybe he should just leave them and go when the front door opened. Rachel Whitman appeared in the doorway, her thin figure framed by the entrance. She had the same dark hair as her daughters, pulled back in a simple bun, wearing modest clothes, jeans, and a grey top. Her pale face showed deep circles under her eyes, but they lit up at the sight of the girls. That light vanished, replaced by something cold and hard when she noticed Dylan. Sophie, Lila, inside now, she ordered, her voice cutting like ice. The twins hesitated momentarily, sensing the tension in the air. Mommy, this is Mr. Carter, the man who... Sophie began. I know who he is, Rachel cut her off. Go inside immediately. The girls obeyed, casting confused looks behind them. Lila still clutched the bag of cans, now forgotten in her hand. The door shut behind them, leaving Rachel on the porch, staring at Dylan with eyes that had lost all the warmth they'd shown her daughters seconds before. What do you want with my daughters? She asked bluntly, not bothering with formalities. I found them collecting cans, Dylan explained, staying by the gate, aware this was her territory. It was getting late, so I offered to bring them home. Rachel crossed her arms, her thin body tense like a violin string about to snap. And why would a man like you be interested in two little girls rummaging through trash? The harshness of her question hit him like a slap. I met them yesterday at the grocery store, he replied. They mentioned you were sick. I just wanted to help. Rachel's eyes narrowed dangerously. I'm not sick, and we don't need your help. They seemed worried, Dylan insisted, choosing his words carefully. If there's anything I can do, medicine, doctor's visits. Rich people don't help poor people, Mr. Carter, Rachel interrupted, her voice as cold as a blade. Not without wanting something in return. The bluntness of her statement hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to protest, to say he was genuinely concerned, that he had no ulterior motives, but the words died before reaching his lips. It's not like that, he managed finally. I just want to help. Your daughters are amazing, and if they're worried about your health— My health is none of your business, Rachel cut in, and my daughters are not your charity project of the day. Dylan took a deep breath, trying a different approach. I understand your distrust, Miss Whitman, but the girls said you were sick and needed help. If there's a medical issue, I could— The only issue here is you, standing on my doorstep, trying to buy what's not for sale, Rachel interrupted again. I don't need your fancy doctors or your pity. It's not pity, Dylan insisted. It's humanity. A bitter smile appeared on Rachel's lips. Humanity, she repeated, the word sounding like an insult. It's convenient to discover humanity when you have millions in the bank and nothing more interesting to do. Each word was spoken with calculated coldness, as if she had been saving this speech for a long time, waiting for the chance to use it. You're being unfair, Dylan said, trying to maintain his composure. Life is unfair, Mr. Carter. Something people like you rarely find out. Dylan swallowed the defensive response that formed in his mind. There was something in Rachel's posture, not just anger, but a deep pain, that made him back off. I'm sorry if I gave the wrong impression, he said finally. I really just wanted to help, after hearing you were sick. I'm not sick, Rachel replied, her voice a bit less sharp. My daughters, sometimes they exaggerate. A cold becomes pneumonia in their imagination. It was the first concession, the first moment of vulnerability she allowed. I'm glad you're well, Dylan responded sincerely. Rachel studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge his true intentions. Thank you for bringing my girls home, she said at last, her voice still cold but less hostile. But don't come back. We don't need your money or your humanity. Dylan nodded, understanding that any insistence would only worsen things. Understood, he said simply. I apologize for any trouble. He turned to leave, but Rachel's voice stopped him one last time. Mr. Carter. He turned around, meeting those dark eyes so much like her daughter's, but without their innocence, hardened by experiences he could only imagine. Rich people don't help poor people, she repeated, with a finality that left no room for argument. They just use them and throw them away when they get tired of playing savior. Without waiting for a response, Rachel went inside and shut the door firmly, leaving Dylan alone in the twilight that was beginning to cloak the quiet street. He remained there for a moment, absorbing the impact of those cutting words. Part of him wanted to argue, to defend himself, to prove her wrong. But another part, more honest, wondered whether there was some truth to her accusation. After all, what had brought him here? Genuine concern, or an elaborate way to feel better about himself? Where was the line between helping and meddling, between compassion and condescension? With those questions weighing on his mind, Dylan began walking back toward the city center. With each step that took him farther from the small brick house, he felt more out of place in his own world, as if he had awakened from a long, comfortable dream into a more complex, more unsettling reality. The city lights were coming on, bright points against the darkening sky. Somewhere ahead was the building where he lived, his isolated tower overlooking everything and connecting to nothing, and for the first time, the idea of returning there did not bring the usual comfort of solitude. Rachel's words followed him back, not as an accusation, but as a mirror reflecting something he had never truly examined. The night was long for Dylan. Rachel Whitman's words, "Rich people don't help poor people," played over and over in his mind like an inescapable refrain. Lying in the king-size bed that rarely gave him peaceful sleep, he stared at the ceiling, revisiting their encounter. The coldness in her eyes, the immediate suspicion, the automatic rejection of any help, and the girls. Sophie and Lila, rummaging through trash as if it were a game, collecting cans with the dignity of those fulfilling an important mission. Children who should be playing in parks, not working to supplement family income. By 5 in the morning, Dylan gave up on trying to sleep. He took a long shower, dressed simply, jeans, t-shirt, sneakers, and left before the sun was fully up. The 24-hour supermarket was almost empty at that hour. Dylan pushed a cart through the aisles, stopping to consider each item with a care he had never before given to his own shopping. What would a family like the Whitmans need? What would be useful without seeming condescending? What would help without offending Rachel's pride? He filled the cart with basic groceries: rice, beans, pasta, tomato sauce, flour, sugar, oil, fresh fruits, some treats he thought the twins would like, cleaning supplies, school materials, a well-equipped first aid kit, vitamins. In the pharmacy section, he hesitated. Rachel had denied being sick, but the dark circles under her eyes, her pale skin suggested otherwise. He added pain relievers, cough medicine, stomach remedies. Better to have them and not need them. At the checkout, the sleepy cashier barely looked at him while ringing up the items. Dylan paid in cash, avoiding the credit card that would immediately identify him as someone who didn't need to count pennies. Outside, the sky was slowly brightening. Dylan arranged the groceries in a rented car, another deliberate choice to appear common, not ostentatious. He drove slowly to the Whitman house, parking at a discreet distance. The neighborhood was still asleep. Only a cat roamed the rooftops, eyeing the intruder with suspicion. Dylan carried the bags carefully to the small brick house. In the dim morning light, it looked even more modest. A crack on the side wall, a loose step on the porch, a clogged gutter. Minor issues that would cost a fortune in labor, insignificant for someone with Dylan's resources. He placed the bags gently on the doorstep, arranged so they wouldn't tip over or block the door. On top of the pile, a simple white envelope with no embellishments. Inside, a handwritten note. "If you need anything, I'm at the Breeze Hotel. Dylan Carter." Nothing more. No elaborate message about charity or pity. No attempt to justify the gesture, just a name and a place. A possibility, not an imposition. He looked at the bags one last time, uncertain whether he was crossing some invisible line of dignity Rachel had drawn. But then he remembered the twins, their small hands digging through trash, their genuine smiles despite everything. Some lines might need to be crossed. He walked away quickly, not looking back, not waiting to see their reaction. This wasn't a gesture that demanded witnesses or thanks. It was simply something he felt compelled to do, like answering a call he hadn't realized he was hearing. Rachel Whitman woke to the alarm. 6:30, like every day. 15 minutes before the twins, enough time to prepare breakfast before dropping them off at the neighbor's house so she could work. She rubbed her tired eyes. The persistent headache was still there, as it had been for months, but today it felt slightly less severe. Maybe she was finally getting better. She slipped on a worn robe over her nightgown, put on slippers, and walked to the kitchen. She set water to boil, mentally counting how much coffee was left, probably enough for 2 more days. Then she'd have to choose between coffee or milk for the girls. The budget didn't allow both. She glanced through the kitchen window at the morning sky. Another day, another battle. 8 hours standing behind a store counter, then 4 hours cleaning an office downtown. If all went well, she might be home by 9 at night, in time to tuck the twins in. She was about to open the front door to check the weather when she saw shapes through the frosted glass, something on the porch. Her heart sped up instinctively. Eviction notices sometimes came like that, left surreptitiously at dawn to avoid confrontations. She opened the door slowly, bracing for the worst. Bags, several of them, carefully arranged. Through the plastic, she could see groceries, cleaning supplies, even what looked like a first aid kit, and on top, a white envelope. Rachel looked up and down the empty street, searching for whoever had left them. But she knew, even before opening the envelope, who had done it. The man from the day before, Dylan Carter. She picked up the note, reading the simple message. No demands, no condescending tone, just information. Where to find him, if she wanted. Her first instinct was to reject everything. To push the bags away, leave them on the curb for anyone else to take. Pride was often the only thing that couldn't be taken from her. But then she thought of the twins, of the constant struggle to keep food on the table, of the headache medicine she'd run out of last week, which she couldn't afford to replace until the next paycheck. With a heavy sigh, Rachel began carrying the bags inside one by one. There was more than she'd initially realized. Enough food for weeks. School materials the girls needed, but she'd postponed buying. Medicines, exactly the kind she often used. In the last bag, something unexpected. 2 small identical brown teddy bears with blue bows around their necks. Gifts for Sophie and Lila, carefully chosen so they wouldn't fight over different designs. Rachel sat down at the kitchen chair, surrounded by the bags, the note still in her hand. Tears threatened to form, but she held them back as she had learned to do for years. It was easy to refuse help when it came with conditions, expectations, humiliation. It was harder when it appeared quietly, respecting her dignity with no audience to applaud the benefactor. "Mommy," Sophie's sleepy voice came from the hallway. "What's all this?" Rachel quickly tucked the note into her robe pocket. "Just some things we needed," she answered vaguely. "Let's put them away before breakfast, okay?" While they arranged the items in the nearly empty cupboards, Rachel thought about the note hidden in her pocket. She wouldn't throw it away, nor would she use it, not yet, not as long as she could manage on her own, but she'd keep it, like an emergency key, not certain she'd need it, but aware she might someday. "Breeze Hotel," she murmured to herself while the twins excitedly discussed their new teddy bears. An address now committed to memory, even if she never planned to use it. 3 days passed since Rachel found the bags at her door. 3 days in which she tried to ignore the persistent headache that now spread through her entire body, weighing down her muscles like lead. 3 days pretending she was fine, that it was just fatigue and would pass with a good night's sleep, something she never really got. On the morning of the 4th day, Rachel woke up trembling. The alarm hadn't even gone off, but something was wrong. Very wrong. The room spun when she tried to sit up. Her skin, normally pale, was burning as if on fire. "I just need a shower," she muttered, leaning on the wall to stand. "I just need to freshen up." But her knees gave out before she reached the hallway. The dull thud of her body hitting the floor echoed through the small house. Sophie was the first to wake, always on alert. At 8, she had learned to sleep with one ear open for any disturbance. She jumped out of the bed she shared with Lila and ran into the hallway, finding her mother on the floor, trying to get up. "Mommy," she cried, running to help. "What happened?" "Nothing," Rachel tried to smile, but the effort became a grimace of pain. "I just tripped. Help me up, sweetheart." Sophie tried, but Rachel was too heavy for her thin arms. Lila appeared sleepily at the bedroom door, rubbing her eyes. "Is Mommy sick?" she asked, her small voice full of fear. "No," Rachel insisted, though her body betrayed her words. "I'm just a bit dizzy. If you help me back to bed." The twins stood on either side, their small bodies straining to lift their mother. They managed to drag her back to the bed, where she collapsed, exhausted. Sophie touched her mother's forehead and quickly pulled her hand away, alarmed by the heat. "You're burning up, Mommy. It's a fever." "Just a little one," Rachel mumbled, her eyes heavy. "Go, get yourselves ready, Mrs. Jenkins." "We're not leaving today," Sophie declared, with a firmness that left no room for debate. "We're going to take care of you." Rachel wanted to protest, but the words tangled in her feverish mind. Her eyes closed against her will. "Mommy?" Lila's voice trembled. "Mommy, wake up!" "She's just sleeping," Sophie reassured her sister, though she wasn't certain herself. "Let's get cold water and cloths, like she does when we're sick." The twins worked together with the efficiency born of necessity. They filled a basin with cold tap water, found clean cloths in the kitchen drawer, and went back to the bedroom, placing compresses on their mother's burning forehead and changing them whenever they grew warm. The day wore on. Rachel's fever didn't break. Around noon, She started mumbling incoherent words, her body alternating between violent chills and profuse sweating. "She's getting worse," Lila said, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm scared, Sophie." Sophie was also scared, but she was the oldest by 7 minutes in, as their mom always reminded them, and needed to be strong. She thought about what Rachel would do in this situation. Call a doctor, they couldn't afford it. Neighbors? Most worked during the day. Then she remembered the note, the one her mother thought they didn't know about, but Sophie had seen it hidden in the kitchen drawer next to their small emergency funds box. "I'm going to find help," she decided, getting to her feet. "Stay with her, keep changing the cloths. I'll find someone." "Who?" asked Lila, holding her mother's feverish hand. "The bread man, the one who brought the teddy bears." Lila's eyes widened. "Mommy said not to talk to him." "Mommy is really sick," Sophie replied, already heading to the kitchen. "And he has kind eyes, remember?" She found the card exactly where she expected, grabbed it and shoved it into her pocket. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should change out of her pajamas, but urgency won out. "I'll be right back," she promised her sister. "Lock the door and only open for me." The midday sun was ruthless when Sophie stepped outside. The card said Breeze Hotel. She'd never been there, but she knew where it was, downtown, near that tall glass building. It wasn't too far, but for 8-year-old legs, it might as well have been a journey across the world. Still, she started walking, running at first, then sprinting, fear fueling her determination. People stared curiously at a little girl in pajamas running alone, but no one stopped her. No one asked if she needed help. Sophie ignored the looks, focused on going forward. Her breathing burned, her bare feet hurt on the hot sidewalks. But she didn't slow down. Mommy needed help. Nothing else mattered. Dylan was in the lobby of the Breeze Hotel, about to head to a meeting, when he noticed a commotion near the revolving door. Employees had gathered, whispering and pointing to someone, or something, that had just come in. That was when he saw her. Sophie, still in pajamas, hair disheveled, feet dirty, face flushed with tears and sweat. She looked lost and desperate in the luxurious reception area. "Sophie!" Dylan crossed the lobby in long strides, kneeling in front of her. "What happened? Where's your sister?" "Mommy," Sophie choked out between sobs. "Mommy's really bad." The fear in the little girl's eyes was palpable, raw. Dylan felt his chest tighten. "Is she home?" "Lila's with her." Sophie nodded, unable to speak more. She held out the crumpled card to Dylan, as if that explained her presence and her boldness in seeking him out. "Let's go," he said, scooping her up without hesitation. "My car's outside." Ignoring the curious stares of other guests, Dylan carried Sophie to the parking lot. He gently placed her in the passenger seat, fastening her seatbelt. "Everything will be okay," he promised, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We're going to get your mum right now." The drive to the Whitman's house never felt so long. Sophie gave directions in short, halting sentences between sobs. Her worry for her mother was so tangible. Dylan could almost touch it in the car's confines. When they arrived, Lila was at the door, hopping from foot to foot in anxiety at the sight of the car. She ran to them before Dylan even cut the engine. "She won't wake up properly," Lila sobbed, clinging to Dylan's hand as soon as he got out. "She tries to talk, but it doesn't make sense." Dylan followed the twins inside their modest home. The contrast between the hotel's luxury and this simple place was never so stark and so irrelevant. In the small bedroom, Rachel lay on the bed, covered despite the heat, her body visibly shaking. Warm, damp cloths dotted around her head. Her face, normally pale, was flushed and covered in sweat. "Rachel," Dylan called softly, stepping closer. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused. "The girls," she murmured. "Take care." "They're fine," he reassured her, touching her forehead. The heat radiating from her was alarming. "I'm here to help. I'm taking you to the hospital." A feeble protest died on Rachel's lips as another wave of shivers racked her body. Dylan wasted no more time. Carefully, he wrapped her in the sheets and lifted her into his arms. "Grab your teddy bears," he told the twins, who watched in fear. "And anything else you want to bring." We might be out for a while." While the girls ran off to gather their belongings, Dylan carried Rachel to the car, settling her gently in the back seat. Her body felt too light, he realized grimly, like she had been wasting away for some time. Sophie and Lila returned quickly, each holding a small backpack and clutching their teddy bears to their chests. "Get in," Dylan instructed, "and buckle up." On the drive to the hospital, he made several calls, activating contacts to ensure there would be no wait or red tape upon arrival. The Carter name opened doors, and for once, Dylan felt genuinely grateful for that power. When they got to the ER, a team was already waiting. Rachel was swiftly transferred to a stretcher and taken inside, leaving Dylan with two scared little girls clinging to his legs. "Where are they taking Mommy?" Lila asked, tears rolling down her cheeks. "To take care of her," Dylan explained, kneeling to their level. "The doctors will make her better." "Is she going to die?" Sophie asked in a whisper, carrying the weight of a deep and familiar fear. "No," Dylan answered firmly. "She won't. I promise." A promise he had no right to make, but felt compelled to offer. The twins looked at him with that mix of distrust and hope only children can express, wanting to believe, but already learning that adults can't always keep promises. They were taken to a waiting room, quieter than the main area but still public. Dylan sat on one of the blue vinyl couches, the twins immediately settling on either side of him, as if afraid to be apart. "I'm hungry," Lila murmured, after almost an hour of silent waiting. Dylan realized that in the middle of the emergency, no one had thought about food. What time was it? It was already past 3. They probably hadn't had lunch. "Let's get something to eat," he said, standing up. "Then we can ask about your mum." In the hospital cafeteria, the twins ate in silence, their eyes occasionally darting to Dylan as if scared he might disappear too. "You were very brave today," he tried to distract them. "Especially you, Sophie, coming to find me alone." "Mommy says we have to be brave," she replied, fiddling with her straw, "but I was scared." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Dylan said. "It means doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." The girls thought about it, nodding slowly. When they returned to the waiting room, a doctor was waiting for them. "Mr. Carter," he asked, extending his hand. "Dr. Mercer, I'm taking care of Miss Whitman." "How is she?" Dylan asked immediately. The doctor briefly glanced at the twins before responding, choosing his words carefully. "She has a serious bacterial infection, likely stemming from a common flu. Her fever is very high, but we've started powerful antibiotics. We'll keep her hospitalized for observation." "Can we see her?" Lila asked, her voice small but hopeful. The doctor smiled kindly. "Not yet, sweetie. Your mum's sleeping now because of the medication. Maybe tomorrow when she's more stable." "Is she going to get better?" Sophie insisted, her eyes locked on the doctor's, as if searching for any sign of a lie. "We believe so," he answered honestly. "She's young, and although she's quite weak, she seems like a strong person." The twins absorbed this with the resignation of children who have learned not everything goes as they want. "Where will we stay?" Sophie asked, looking at Dylan with anxious eyes. The question caught him off guard. He hadn't considered that, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't leave them alone. "We'll stay here," he replied firmly. "We'll wait here in the hospital until we can see your mum." "What about you?" Lila looked at Dylan. "Are you going to leave?" The vulnerability in that simple question hit Dylan like a punch. How many times had these girls been left? How many adults they trusted had disappeared? "No," he answered, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay with you." The identical expressions of relief on the girls' faces almost broke his heart. The next few hours passed slowly. Traffic in the hospital eased as night set in. The twins, exhausted by the day's events, dozed off in the waiting room couch, using the jackets Dylan found as makeshift blankets. Lila was soon deeply asleep, clutching her teddy bear. Sophie fought sleep, her heavy eyes opening occasionally to check if Dylan was still there. "Go to sleep," he whispered gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded drowsily and finally gave in, her breathing becoming deep and steady. Dylan watched them both, feeling a mix of admiration and sadness. So young to carry such worries, so little to already know the fear of being abandoned. Periodically, he went to the nurse's station to ask about Rachel. Stable, they told him. Her fever is coming down. She's resting. Around midnight, a nurse approached him, an older woman with a maternal yet efficient air. Mr. Carter. Ms. Whitman is awake. She asked about her daughters. Dylan looked at the twins sleeping. They just fell asleep. I don't want to wake them. The nurse nodded understandingly. It's best to let them rest, but... She hesitated. Ms. Whitman also asked about you. Dylan felt a spark of surprise. Me? Yes? She seemed concerned whether you were still here with the girls. Casting one last glance at Sophie and Lila, confirming they were comfortable, he followed the nurse. Rachel's room was quiet except for the rhythmic beep of monitors. Soft lights illuminated her face, still pale but no longer feverish. IV lines delivered fluids and medication to her thin arm. When Dylan entered, her eyes opened slowly. They focused on him with a clarity missing earlier. The haze of high fever had lifted. The girls was the first thing that left her dry lips. They're asleep in the waiting room, Dylan answered, stopping at a respectful distance. They're fine. Worried about you, but fine. Rachel nodded slightly, seeming relieved. Then concern returned to her features. You could have left, she said, her voice weak but firm. You already did more than enough. I couldn't leave them alone, he replied simply. Rachel studied him for a long moment, like trying to solve a complex puzzle. Why? She finally asked. Why are you doing this? A simple question. But Dylan knew it carried the weight of years of disappointments and abandonments. Because no one should go through this alone, he said sincerely. And because your daughters are incredible. And because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because sometimes people just need someone to stay. Rachel briefly closed her eyes, as though those words were too much to process in her weakened state. I can't stay here, she murmured. I can't pay. I don't have insurance that covers. Don't worry about that now, Dylan interrupted gently. Just rest. I'll take care of the girls. A simple, direct promise. No grand statements or elaborate offers, just the assurance that for this moment, she wasn't alone. Rachel looked at him intently, as if searching for dishonesty or ulterior motives. She found only sincerity. Thank you, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Rest, Dylan repeated. I'll look after the girls. We'll be here when you wake up. She nodded, eyes already closing, the exhaustion and medication pulling her back to the sleep she desperately needed. Dylan left quietly, returning to the waiting room where the twins slept. He sat on the couch beside them, preparing for a long night. A hospital staffer offered him a blanket and pillow, which he accepted with a silent nod of thanks. As he settled in for what he knew would be an uncomfortable night, Dylan reflected on how life could change in an instant. A week ago, he hadn't known Rachel Whitman or her daughters. He had no idea these three interconnected lives existed, struggling to make it in an often hostile world. Now he was here, in a hospital waiting room, watching over two little girls who trusted him enough to sleep at his side. Bound to a promise he made to a woman who, until recently, saw him with suspicion and resentment. Life was strange, unpredictable. The twins stirred in their sleep, Sophie muttering something unintelligible. Dylan adjusted the blanket over them, more gently than he ever thought himself capable of. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the next day, or when Rachel recovered. He didn't know how he would explain his days away from work or what repercussions there might be. He didn't know if Rachel would accept his help once she was strong enough to refuse it again. He only knew that, for now, he was exactly where he needed to be. For the first time, someone was simply staying. The hospital had its own rhythms, Dylan soon discovered. The organized rush of mornings when doctors made their rounds, the relative calm of afternoons when visitors filled hallways with hushed voices and careful steps, the peculiar stillness of nights, broken only by nurses' murmurs and the constant beep of monitors. After 3 days, Rachel was moved to a regular room. Her body responded well to antibiotics. The fever finally under control, though weakness lingered. The doctors mentioned discharging her soon if she kept improving. Dylan established a routine. In the mornings, he handled the most urgent business matters by phone or email, giving precise instructions to his assistants. Early in the afternoon, he arrived at the hospital with something in hand: a book for the twins, a simple bouquet for Rachel's room, or food better than cafeteria fare. The girls waited for him with growing anticipation, stationed by the door or at the window overlooking the corridor, alert at any sign of his arrival. "Dylan!" Lila would inevitably shout upon seeing him, running to him, all initial reserve forgotten. Sophie maintained a bit more composure, waiting for him to enter before hugging him. But hug him she did, her small body pressing against him in a gesture of newfound trust. Rachel watched these interactions from her bed, her expression carefully neutral. At first there was tension in her eyes, as if she expected everything to turn out a sham. But as days passed, that tension yielded to something harder to name. Not quite trust, but perhaps a temporary suspension of distrust. One day, Dylan brought a board game, something simple enough for 8-year-olds. "I've never played this," Sophie admitted, examining the colorful pieces. "I'll teach you," Dylan offered, sitting on the small space at the foot of Rachel's bed. "It's not hard." The twins settled in next to their mother, who shifted slightly to give them room, suppressing a small grimace of pain, though not quickly enough to escape Dylan's notice. "Should we play at the table?" he suggested, concerned. "Give you more space to rest." "I'm fine," Rachel replied, her first voluntary contribution to the conversation since he arrived. "I'd like to watch the game too." That simple sentence, an admission that she wanted to participate, even as a spectator, felt like a small victory. Dylan offered a brief smile and started explaining the rules. The game progressed with the twins' laughter and Rachel's occasional comments, usually helping her daughters with strategies or reminding them of rules they'd just learned. It was almost a normal family scene, were it not for the hospital setting and the complicated story that had brought them there. At some point, when Sophie cheered for a particularly good move, Dylan caught Rachel watching him, not the twins, but him. There was no hostility in her gaze, only a sort of silent assessment. When their eyes met, she did not immediately look away, as she would have days before. She held his gaze for a few seconds, then turned back to the game. A faint, almost imperceptible nod, the only acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. The next day, Dylan brought books, one for each twin, carefully selected after noticing their interests. For Lila, a colorful volume of reimagined fairy tales with vibrant illustrations. For Sophie, more reserved and thoughtful, a story about a girl who discovers a secret world in her attic. "How did you know I'd like this?" Sophie asked, leafing through the pages with genuine admiration. Dylan smiled. "You remind me a little of the main character, observant, curious." Sophie soaked up the compliment with a small, proud smile. "Thank you," Rachel said when the girls were engrossed in the books, her voice low, almost hesitant, as though still testing the sensation of gratitude. "You're welcome," Dylan replied simply, making no fuss over the moment. The days followed their course. Dylan's visits became part of the routine in room 312. Nurses greeted him by name. Some even saved him the comfiest chair when they knew he was on his way. One afternoon, he brought his laptop, and at the twins' request, showed them photos of places he had visited: snow-covered mountains, white sand beaches, ancient cities with fairy tale architecture. "Can we go there someday?" Lila asked, pointing to a picture of dolphins leaping in turquoise waters. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. It was a "we" that included Dylan. It was hope for a future beyond the hospital. "Maybe," Dylan answered carefully, aware of Rachel's gaze. "The world is full of amazing places to see." Later that day, after the twins went with a hospital volunteer to grab some ice cream, Rachel ended the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "You don't have to answer their questions about the future," she said, her voice holding more resignation than bitterness. "They're kids. They don't understand how things work." Dylan considered his words before replying, "And how do things work, Rachel?" She looked away, toward the window, where afternoon light cast patterns on the linoleum floor. People help when it's convenient. Then they go on with their lives. The simplicity of that statement, the calm certainty of someone who knows the pain of abandonment, cut Dylan deeply. "Not always," he said. Rachel didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes of skepticism. When the twins returned, carrying an extra ice cream for Dylan, "We chose chocolate because everyone likes chocolate," the conversation was left hanging. On the eve of her discharge, Dylan arrived earlier than usual. He found Rachel sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to fold the few clothes they had brought from home. "Let me help," he offered, moving forward to pick up one of Lila's small t-shirts. Surprisingly, Rachel didn't protest. She simply moved aside, making room for him to sit. They folded clothes together in silence, while the twins colored activity books a nurse had given them. "Thank you," Rachel said softly after a few minutes. "Not just for this." "For Vitas," she gestured vaguely, as if trying to encompass everything. The hospital, caring for the girls, being constantly there. "You're welcome," Dylan said, understanding all that was left unsaid. As he was about to leave later that night, Rachel did something unexpected. She reached out and briefly touched his arm, the most direct physical contact she had ever initiated. "See you tomorrow," she said, not as a question but not entirely as a statement. There was a disguised vulnerability, a hesitant invitation. "See you tomorrow," Dylan confirmed. On his way back to the hotel, he realized he was smiling for no apparent reason. Something was shifting slowly and silently, like tectonic plates moving imperceptibly beneath the Earth's surface. Bonds were forming, invisible yet undeniable. Between two people destiny had placed in separate worlds, and between one lonely man and two little girls who, without knowing, were filling a void he hadn't known existed. The day of Rachel's discharge arrived with unexpectedly strong sunshine for that time of year. Dylan parked in front of the hospital at exactly 10 in the morning, as agreed. In the back seat of his car were two child safety seats he had bought the night before. In room 312, he found the twins ready, backpacks on their shoulders, teddy bears clutched firmly in their small hands. Rachel sat at the edge of the bed, wearing her own clothes instead of a hospital gown, simple jeans and a faded blue blouse. She looked thinner than before, Dylan noted, the clothes slightly loose on her frame. "All set?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Rachel nodded, visibly uncomfortable. Not in physical pain, Dylan realized, but with the situation. Dependence, needing to accept help. "The girls are really excited to go home," she replied, sidestepping a direct answer. A nurse appeared with a wheelchair, a standard procedure for hospital discharges. Rachel looked at it as if it were a personal insult. "I don't need that," she said, attempting to stand on her own. "Mom," Sophie interjected with a seriousness that seemed too big for her small face. "The doctor said you still need to rest." Dylan observed the exchange between mother and daughter, the reluctance in Rachel, the concern in Sophie. It was almost as though their roles were reversed, the child caring for the adult. "Okay," Rachel finally conceded, lowering herself into the wheelchair with obvious displeasure. The exit from the hospital was quiet. Though the twins were excited, they seemed to sense Rachel's tension and fell unusually silent. Dylan led them to the parking lot, helping Rachel into the front passenger seat while he installed the girls in their new child seats. "These seats are new?" Sophie asked, always observant. "They are," Dylan answered simply, adjusting her seatbelt. "For us?" she persisted. Dylan smiled. "Who else would they be for?" The drive back to the Whitmans' house was mostly filled with Lila's excited voice, pointing out everything she saw through the window, as if rediscovering the world after being confined to the hospital. Rachel remained silent, gazing out at the passing scenery, occasionally closing her eyes when the car jolted. When they arrived, Dylan noticed Rachel hesitate. Her house, once a refuge, now presented a physical challenge, steps to climb, meals to cook, responsibilities to resume. "I'll help you settle in," he offered in a casual tone, as though it were the most natural thing. Rachel didn't immediately respond, her gaze fixed on the small brick structure. "All right," she said finally, and Dylan understood how much that simple agreement cost her. The twins ran ahead, eager to see their home again. Dylan offered his arm to Rachel to help her up the entrance steps. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted. Her touch was light, just enough to keep balance, but Dylan sensed the symbolic weight of the gesture. The house was exactly as they'd left it days before. Small, modest, but impeccably clean and organized. The bags of groceries Dylan had brought before Rachel's hospitalization were still partially visible in the kitchen cabinet. "I'll fix us something to eat," Dylan decided, heading to the kitchen naturally. Rachel followed, lightly supporting herself on the furniture as she moved. "You don't have to," she said, but without her usual firmness. "I know," he replied, already opening the fridge to see what was available. "But I want to." The twins entered the kitchen, having already dropped their backpack somewhere else in the house. There was something comforting in the ease with which they resumed their routine, as if the hospital days had been just a brief interruption. "Can I help?" Sophie offered, stepping closer to Dylan. "Me too," Lila added, not wanting to be left out. "Sure," Dylan smiled. "Sophie, could you grab the plates?" Lila, the forks and knives. Watching her daughters eagerly take on tasks, Rachel sat at the small kitchen table. Something in her expression, a mix of gratitude and apprehension, made it clear she was witnessing something both precious and perilous. Lunch was simple: sandwiches, soup heated up, some fruit. They ate together, the twins keeping the conversation lively with hospital stories, kind nurses and cafeteria ice cream. After the meal, Dylan insisted Rachel rest. She didn't fight it too much. The fatigue from the ride home and the emotional stress were evident. The twins, for their part, were too excited, showing Dylan every corner of the house, their favorite toys, books, pictures taped to their bedroom walls. When the sun began to set, Dylan prepared a light dinner. He called the girls to help set the table again, creating a sense of normalcy and routine. Rachel reappeared, looking a bit more rested. There was something different in her demeanor, a quiet resolve, like she had made a decision during her nap. After dinner, while the twins went to brush their teeth and get ready for bed, Rachel and Dylan were left alone in the small living room. The silence between them was no longer as uncomfortable as in the early days, but it still carried an undefined weight. "I don't understand," Rachel finally said, her voice low, almost to herself. "Why you keep coming here?" It wasn't exactly a question, but Dylan sensed it deserved an answer. "Because I want to help," he said simply. Rachel shook her head slightly. "No one helps without a reason." There was a sad certainty in her words, clearly born of painful experiences. What would my reason be then?" Dylan asked softly. Rachel raised her eyes to meet his directly. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Another silence descended, heavier than the last. Dylan didn't try to fill it, respecting Rachel's process. "I used to work in a mansion," she said abruptly, her voice surprisingly steady. "Before the girls were born. Housekeeper, cook is whatever they needed. The family was wealthy, powerful. The youngest son..." She paused and taking a deep breath. "When I got pregnant, they fired me. No warning, no references, nothing. Threw me out. Like trash that could stain their reputation." Dylan remained still, aware of the privilege it was to hear this story, aware of how much it cost Rachel to share it. "I tried to sue, got threatened. Lawyers, intimidation." A bitter smile curved her lips. "I learned quickly how the world works. Ever since, I've learned to survive, alone." The last word carried so much weight, so many untold stories. Alone, even with 2 daughters to raise. Alone against a system that favored the powerful. Alone in her distrust of any offered help. "And then you show up," she went on, studying Dylan's reaction. "Rich, generous, interested in the girls. And I wonder, what do you want in return?" The frankness of her question was raw, painful, but also liberating. Everything was finally on the table. "I didn't come here to save you, Rachel," Dylan answered after a moment. "I'm not here to be a hero or to feel better about myself." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "I just want to be around, if you let me. No expectations, no strings attached." Rachel studied him for a long moment, as though she could decipher hidden truths by the intensity of her stare. "The girls like you," she said finally. "I like them," Dylan replied sincerely. "They're extraordinary kids." The sound of the twins returning from the bathroom broke the moment. Lila came running, already in pajamas, hair damp from washing. "Will you tell us a story?" she asked Dylan with the ease of someone who already considered his presence a given. Rachel took in the scene, the hope in her daughter's faces, the gentleness with which Dylan responded. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Just one," she agreed, surprising everyone, including herself. "Then it's bedtime." As Dylan followed the girls to their bedroom, he felt Rachel's gaze trailing after him. There was no longer the initial hostility, nor the cutting distrust. Just watchfulness, cautious but with a slight opening, like a door that after years locked, finally cracks open to let in a bit of light. The Breeze Hotel lobby was quiet when Dylan arrived. The night doorman gave a discreet nod as he crossed the foyer toward the private elevator leading directly to the penthouse. At some point in the past weeks, he had stopped registering these small gestures of deference that had always punctuated his life. The elevator rose silently, the illuminated numbers marking the ascent. 5, 6, 7. Each floor took him further from the world below, from the modest apartment he had just left Rachel and the twins in. When the doors opened onto the expansive penthouse, Dylan hesitated before stepping out. For a fleeting moment, almost imperceptible, he felt like a visitor in his own domain. The penthouse was impressive by any standard, spacious, elegant, minimalist without being cold. Large panoramic windows framed the nighttime city, its lights twinkling like artificial stars. A living work of art, constantly in motion. Dylan walked to the bar, poured himself a whiskey, then stopped, glass in hand, absorbing the silence. Not the same silence he'd found in Rachel's house after the twins went to bed. Over there, the silence felt alive. Small noises in the old house, the gentle breathing of sleeping children, the occasional creak of wood. A lived-in silence. Here the silence was different, perfect. Manufactured, isolated from the world by architectural design and financial privilege. He wandered through the rooms slowly, as if truly seeing them for the first time. The living room with its Italian sofa that never hosted a gathering of friends, the gourmet kitchen where he rarely cooked. The master bedroom with its king-size bed, impeccably made by the hotel staff every morning, whether used or not. Stopping before one of the windows, Dylan contemplated the view for which he paid a small fortune. The city stretched below, its shape defined by illuminated roads and shimmering buildings. Far off, almost beyond sight, lay the neighborhood where Rachel and the twins lived. Too small to discern from this height, the contrast could not be clearer. Here, up high, was everything money could buy. Down there, a family struggled to pay bills, to buy bread to survive with dignity. He recalled Rachel's words. "When I got pregnant, they fired me, they threw me out." How many times in his years of business had he seen similar stories? Employees dismissed for being inconvenient, people treated like replaceable parts in a bigger machine. How many times had he looked away, accepting such practices as simply the way the world works? Dylan sank onto the sofa, whiskey still untouched in his hand. Unexpectedly, he remembered Lila's voice asking for a bedtime story, her wide, trusting eyes fixed on him. He remembered Sophie correcting her sister about some detail, always watchful, always protective despite her age. He remembered Rachel's expression as she watched them together, cautious, evaluating, but no longer hostile. A soft laugh escaped his lips, echoing strangely in the empty space. What irony. He, Dylan Carter, whose decisions impacted entire markets, whose name opened doors, whose fortune could buy almost anything, seeking acceptance from a family that could barely afford their bills. He took a sip of whiskey, feeling the amber liquid burn gently down his throat. "I never had a family," he murmured to the emptiness. "I only learned how to live up high alone." Spoken aloud for the first time, the words carried surprising weight. It was true, he realized. An orphan raised by distant guardians and boarding schools, he learned early to rely only on himself, to view relationships as transactions, to maintain emotional distance as a survival strategy. His adult life only reinforced those lessons. In business, his reputation as a ruthless negotiator was almost legendary. Even his few friends only knew the public, controlled, successful Dylan. He rarely allowed himself to be vulnerable. And now, he was drawn to a family that offered nothing but themselves. No useful connections, no strategic advantage, no tangible benefits. Just two girls with easy smiles, and a woman whose distrust had been carved by life's hardness. He rose, walking back to the window. This time, he tried to imagine the view from Rachel's small apartment. What would it be like to look up at these distant skyscrapers, each light representing someone with more resources, more opportunities, more security? A strange feeling formed in his chest. Not exactly guilt, but a sort of belated understanding. For years he believed height protected him. That distance was synonymous with power. Now, he was beginning to realize it also meant isolation. The penthouse, which had always been his refuge, suddenly felt too big, too empty. It lacked something essential, the sound of small footsteps running down the hallway. Spontaneous laughter, even the tension of difficult conversations. It lacked life. Dylan finished his drink and placed the glass on the coffee table. Tomorrow he would go back. He'd bring something for dinner, maybe help the twins with some task. Maybe Rachel would let him stay a bit longer. Maybe, with time, he could prove that not every rich man threw people away when they became inconvenient. It was a modest beginning, without big promises or dramatic proclamations, just a quiet decision to keep showing up, to keep being there. He headed to the bedroom, unbuttoning his shirt as he walked. The silence followed him, as it always did. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't at peace with it. For the first time, the silence felt less like a luxury and more like an absence. In the king-size bed, lying alone under the high ceiling, Dylan stayed awake for a long time. His thoughts drifted through the city, descending from the luxurious hotel to the small apartment where 3 people slept, a family united by bonds no amount of money could buy. The digital glow of the bedside clock marked the slow passage of hours. 2 in the morning. 3. Eventually, the city lights began to go out, one by one. Dylan watched that slow darkening, thinking how the most important lights, those hidden in small houses, in genuine smiles, in hard-won gestures of trust, couldn't be seen from his privileged viewpoint. He finally closed his eyes, letting the penthouse silence envelop him. Tomorrow he would go down again. Tomorrow, for a few hours, he would trade all this silent luxury for the noisy chaos of a small apartment, where for the first time in many years, he did not feel alone. A week passed since Rachel's return home from the hospital. Dylan kept his word, stopping by daily with groceries or ready-made meals, helping with small household tasks, and spending time with the twins. The initial tension had eased into an almost comfortable routine, though there were still hesitant moments from both sides. That Saturday morning, Dylan arrived earlier than usual. He carried only a thin folder under his arm, instead of his usual shopping bags. Rachel noticed the difference immediately when she opened the door. "Good morning," he greeted, a subtle formality in his tone that hadn't been there before. "Good morning," Rachel answered, stepping aside to let him in. Her gaze briefly rested on the folder, but she didn't ask about it. The twins were still asleep, taking advantage of the weekend's freedom. The house was quiet, bathed in the gentle morning light filtering through the thin curtains. "Coffee?" Rachel offered, heading to the kitchen. Her mobility had improved greatly, though she still moved carefully. "Thank you," Dylan accepted, following her. The small kitchen, with its worn floor but spotless cleanliness, had become the scene of many cautious conversations in recent weeks. It was where Rachel felt most comfortable, her domain, her place. While she prepared coffee in the old machine, Dylan sat at the round table, placing the folder carefully at his side. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it carried a certain expectancy. "You look better," he observed, noticing her smoother movements. "I am," she agreed, pouring 2 cups of coffee. The medicine helped. It was safe small talk, but both knew he hadn't come this early, folder in hand, just for that. Rachel sat opposite him, hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. Her eyes finally settled on the folder. "You have something to tell me," she stated, not as a question. Dylan nodded, taking a sip of coffee before answering. "There's a position open at the Breeze Hotel's laundry," he said directly. "Steady, secure. With health benefits." He paused, gauging her reaction. "It's not charity, it's your choice." Rachel went still, her eyes locked on the coffee cup. Dylan could almost see the battle on her face, distrust versus need, pride versus pragmatism. "Why?" she finally asked, looking up. "Because you deserve a fresh start," he answered simply. "Because you're qualified. Because you need stability." Rachel shook her head slightly, not in refusal but as if trying to sort through her thoughts. "You own the hotel," she said without accusation, just stating a fact. "People will talk." "I'm one of the investors," Dylan corrected gently. "I'm not involved in daily operations. The hiring decision would be up to Margaret, the HR manager. She needs someone reliable and efficient." Rachel stood abruptly, moving to the kitchen window. Outside, the small backyard basked in the morning sun. She stood there for a moment, back to Dylan. "I already have 2 jobs," she said distantly. "The store and the cleaning job at the office. I know, I barely see the girls. I know that too." Rachel turned slowly, her expression a complex blend of emotions. "How much does it pay?" she asked. "Practical? Grounded?" Dylan named a fair, competitive amount, not so high as to seem like disguised charity. He saw Rachel's eyes doing quick calculations, mentally rearranging budgets and possibilities. The sound of small footsteps interrupted the moment. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in pajamas, hair tousled, eyes sleepy but watchful. "Morning," she said, glancing between the adults, picking up on the serious atmosphere immediately. "Morning, sweetheart," Rachel answered, her tone automatically softening. "Hungry?" Sophie nodded, but her gaze remained on Dylan and the folder at the table. Ever observant, she missed nothing. "What's going on?" she asked directly. Rachel hesitated, looking from her daughter to Dylan, then back to Sophie. "Mr. Carter is offering me a job," she said honestly. "At the hotel?" Sophie's eyes widened slightly. "Are we going to live at the hotel?" A brief smile touched Rachel's lips. "No, sweetheart. I'd be working there, in the laundry." Before Sophie could respond, Lila appeared behind her, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Dylan!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up immediately. Without the reserve her sister had, she ran to hug him. Dylan accepted the hug with a smile, noticing Rachel's expression. She no longer seemed distrustful, just cautious, with a hint of something close to affection. "Let's have breakfast," Rachel decided, turning back to the stove. "Then we'll talk more." Breakfast was lively, the twins sharing elaborate dreams and making plans for the day. Dylan joined the conversation, answering their questions, laughing at their stories. But he noticed Rachel was distant, lost in silent considerations. Later, when the girls ran out to the small backyard to play, Rachel finally spoke. "If I accept, would it be possible?" She hesitated, as though the words took physical effort. "Would it be possible to get an advance? Just part of the first paycheck?" "Of course," Dylan answered casually, understanding how difficult it was for her to ask. "I can arrange that today." Rachel nodded, looking out the window at the twins playing. Sophie was setting up some game while Lila hopped excitedly around her. "I accept," she said firmly, the words coming out strong despite the evident internal battle. She turned to Dylan. "I'm tired of just surviving. I want to live with dignity." The simplicity of that statement carried the weight of years of struggle, tough choices, pride bent but never broken. "When can I start?" she asked. Decision made, bringing new determination to her posture. "Monday," Dylan replied, pulling documents from his folder. "Here are the details. Shift from 8 to 4 Monday through Friday." Rachel took the papers, eyes scanning quickly. "That means," she did the math, "I can pick up the girls from school every day." "Yes," Dylan confirmed, noticing how that detail seemed more important than any other benefit. She stood silently for a moment, absorbing the reality of this change she was about to embrace. Then, unexpectedly, she extended her hand across the table. "Thank you," she said simply. Dylan shook her hand, feeling the calluses on her fingers, the marks of years of hard work. "You're welcome." The next few weeks brought subtle yet significant changes. Rachel adjusted quickly to her new job, her natural efficiency impressing even the most experienced co-workers. The twins seemed lighter, knowing their mother would be there at the end of each school day. Dylan kept a respectful distance, visiting only on Saturdays, bringing small gifts for the girls, talking with Rachel about everyday matters. He never mentioned work during those visits, nor the fact that his influence had helped her advance quickly in the laundry structure. 2 months after she started, on a particularly hot Saturday afternoon, Rachel greeted him with a different look, a mix of pride and anxiety. "I found a place," she announced without preamble as soon as the twins ran outside to play. An apartment, small but with 2 bedrooms. Dylan felt a genuine smile forming on his lips. "That's great," he replied sincerely. "It's in a decent building," she continued, words tumbling out as if rehearsed. "Close to the girls' school. I managed to save for the deposit from these 2 months' pay." There was a sparkle in her eyes Dylan had never seen before, uncomplicated hope, genuine pride, the simple joy of a well-earned achievement. "When do you move in?" he asked. "Next weekend," she answered. Then, after a barely perceptible hesitation, If it's not too much trouble, we could use help with a few things." It was the closest thing to a direct request she'd ever made, and Dylan understood the significance of that tiny act of trust. "Of course," he said simply. "Count on me." Moving day dawned bright and promising. Dylan arrived early, finding the twins excited and Rachel organizing the last boxes. The small house, which never had many belongings, seemed oddly empty. "We don't have much," Rachel noted when she saw his glance. There was no shame in her voice, just acceptance. "Makes moving easier," he replied naturally. They worked together, carrying boxes and their few pieces of furniture into the small rented truck. The twins helped with lighter items, running excitedly between the house and the vehicle. There was a buoyancy in the air, the promise of a new beginning making even the hardest tasks feel easier. The new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest but well-kept building. The old elevator fit only 2 people at a time, turning the process of unloading into a small logistical adventure that made the twins giggle with each trip. When the last box was finally placed in the living room, Rachel paused to take it all in. The apartment was small, a compact living room kitchen area, 2 tiny bedrooms, a simple bathroom. The walls needed a fresh coat of paint. The laminate floor showed wear in spots. But light poured generously through the windows, and from the tiny balcony one could see a bit of blue sky. The twins dashed around exploring, their voices echoing off the still empty walls, immediately filling the space with life. Dylan stood by the entrance, giving Rachel space to experience the moment. He watched as she ran her hand over the kitchen counter, tested a shelf's sturdiness, opened and closed the bedroom door, small gestures of someone claiming her territory. "I can set up a few things before I go," he offered when she returned to the living room. Over the next few hours, Dylan assembled a simple bookshelf, fixed a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet, hung curtains in the bedrooms. He worked quietly, answering occasional questions from the twins, who watched with fascination, learning the names of the tools, offering their brand of childish help. By the time the sun was setting, bathing the living room in golden light, the transformation was evident. It wasn't just the physical tasks, there was something more subtle at play. The empty apartment was becoming a home. The twins' teddy bears now held a place of honor on the small living room shelf. Rachel's books, few but well-loved, lined another. A simple framed photo of the twins rested on the table. Dylan packed up his tools, sensing it was time for him to leave. This was their achievement, their moment, their space. "I think that's everything for now," he said, heading toward the door. Rachel walked him out while the twins continued excitedly unpacking their childhood treasures. Shells from some outing, colored stones, carefully saved drawings. The corridor outside was quiet. Only a distant radio from a neighbor's apartment broke the silence. "You don't know how much this means to us," Rachel said, her voice low but resolute, gesturing around as if indicating not just the apartment, but everything, the job, the help, the constant presence. Dylan smiled, offering no verbal reply, sensing that any words would diminish the moment. He simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of her statement. For a moment, he stood there, gazing past Rachel into the apartment. The twins had returned to the living room, unpacking a box of small childlike treasures. Rachel turned to look as well, seeing the same scene. It was just a start, Dylan knew. There were still many challenges ahead, many unmet needs, a lot of history to overcome. But in that moment, watching them create a home, he felt certain he had contributed to something valuable, not with money or power, but with presence and respect. With a final wave, he turned and walked down the corridor, leaving them to their first night in the new place. His footsteps echoed on the tile floor, each one carrying him physically away, but somehow drawing him closer to that small family who, without realizing it, had begun to fill the empty corners of his own life. Autumn had arrived, painting the city's trees in shades of red and gold. Mornings brought that peculiar mist soon burned off by the sun, leaving the air crisp and fresh. Dylan woke early, as he did every Sunday. The routine was almost a ritual now, getting up before 7, taking a long shower, dressing in simple but well-kept clothes, then heading downstairs to the bakery near the hotel. "The usual Mr. Carter?" asked the baker, already bagging a batch of freshly baked artisanal bread still warm from the oven. "Yes, please. And those cinnamon cookies, too." That was another element of the ritual, the cookies for the twins, who waited eagerly for his arrival. He never showed up empty-handed, though he'd learned to keep the gifts modest. It wasn't about buying affection, he realized months ago. It was about consistency, the commitment to always be there, even if just with simple gestures. The building where Rachel and the girls lived wasn't anything remarkable. 3 floors of modest apartments, a facade needing new paint, a small communal garden that various tenants tended with varying degrees of care. But to Dylan, the simplicity had its own kind of beauty, beyond anything a luxury hotel could offer. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, another habit picked up since Sophie declared, "Stairs are more fun than those boring boxes that go up." On the 3rd floor, he paused briefly to adjust the bag of bread and cookies before knocking softly on door 304. He didn't have to wait long. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Lila in cloud-pattern pajamas, hair still rumpled, face bright with a smile. "Dylan!" she shouted, as if his arrival was always a delightful surprise despite its weekly regularity. "Sophie, he's here!" Sophie appeared right behind her sister, more composed but just as pleased. "Did you bring the bread?" she asked, ever practical. "And cookies," he replied, handing over the bag into their eager hands. The living room kitchen area was flooded with gentle morning light. In the past few months, the space had changed considerably. It was still small, still simple, but now carried the distinct personality of its occupants in every detail. Colorful cushions on the small sofa, handmade by Rachel during her downtime. The twins' drawings framed in inexpensive but well-chosen frames, plants in various stages of growth, a new hobby Rachel had taken up. "Good morning," Rachel greeted from the kitchen where she was making coffee. Her hair was in a casual bun, a few strands framing her face. She wore sweatpants and a simple t-shirt, Sunday clothes, comfortable clothes. "Morning," Dylan replied, noticing how different she looked now, not just physically, although the deep circles under her eyes were gone and her features seemed softer. It was in her posture, her movements. The constant tension she once carried had been replaced by a calm born of not having to fight daily, just to survive. "Coffee's almost ready," she said, with that half-smile that had become more frequent in recent months. The twins had already placed the bread on the table and were carefully retrieving the cookies. This too had become part of the Sunday ritual, setting the table for breakfast. Lila laid out napkins, always folded in different shapes, her creativity blossoming with new security. Sophie organized plates and utensils with precision, double-checking everything was in its right place. Dylan took his usual spot, not a chair, but sitting on the rug by the window, leaning against the small sofa. There were only 4 chairs, and though Rachel insisted he could take one, he preferred that corner. From there, he could see the entire living area, watch the sunbeams on the walls, and feel part of the space without overtaking it. Rachel brought over the coffee in simple glass cups, no matching mugs, no fine china. She handed one to Dylan, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. "Thank you," he murmured, accepting the warm drink. The aroma of coffee mixed with the fresh bread, creating that particular Sunday morning scent, now etched into his memory. The twins sat on the rug beside him, forming a small informal circle. Rachel joined them after a few minutes, bringing her own mug and a plate of sliced bread. "How was your week?" Dylan asked, though he already knew bits of it from casual phone calls throughout the days. "Sophie won the spelling bee," Lila announced proudly before her sister could answer. "It wasn't a big deal," Sophie mumbled, though her flushing cheeks betrayed her pride. "It was," Rachel corrected gently. "The teacher said it was the highest score in 5 years." Dylan smiled at Sophie. "Congratulations. That calls for a special celebration." "We already celebrated," Lila informed. "Mom made a cake, and we saved you a slice," Sophie added, standing to fetch it from the fridge. This was the new normal, small inclusions, simple gestures that made him part of their routine, part of their celebrations, part of their lives. It wasn't discussed or formalized. It just happened organically, like water finding its course. Sunday breakfast stretched on lazily, as it always did. No one had to rush, no one had appointments. The twins shared school stories. Rachel talked about her plants finally flowering, and Dylan told a funny anecdote about an eccentric hotel guest. Laughter filled the small apartment, making it feel bigger, more expansive. Later, at the nearby park, Dylan and Rachel sat on a bench under a broad tree, watching the twins chase soap bubbles. "I never imagined this," Rachel said quietly after a few minutes, gazing at her daughters, who laughed as they ran after the shimmering bubbles. "What?" Dylan asked. "This peaceful Sundays, not having to count coins for every meal. Seeing the girls just being kids, not tiny adults worrying." There was a contained emotion in her voice that Dylan rarely heard, vulnerability Rachel generally kept under tight control. "They're extraordinary children," he replied, watching Sophie help a younger kid climb the slide. "They are," Rachel agreed, a gentle smile curving her lips. "Much stronger than they should ever need to be." Another comfortable silence fell between them. In the distance, Lila waved enthusiastically, showing them how high she could swing. "You know," Rachel said, her gaze still on her daughters, "when you showed up that day at the grocery store, I thought you were just another rich guy trying to feel good about himself." Dylan said nothing, letting her continue. "Then, when you left the groceries at the door, I still thought it was something temporary, that you'd get bored and move on." She turned to face him. "But you stayed." The simplicity of that statement carried enormous weight. In the months following her hospital stay, Sunday after Sunday, Dylan had simply stayed. No big declarations, no promises, just present, consistent, reliable. "You all stayed too," he replied softly. On the walk back to the apartment, with the sun beginning its descent, Dylan observed the three walking ahead of him, Rachel in the middle, a twin on each side, hands joined, forming an unbreakable unit. He trailed behind a few steps, part of the group, yet respecting the sacred bond among them. Back at the small apartment, while Rachel prepared a simple dinner and the twins showed Dylan their latest school projects, he reflected on how his life had changed. He still lived in a luxury hotel, still ran his businesses, still frequented the same elite circles. But the most vital part of his existence was here, in this modest apartment, sitting on the floor among children's drawings. He hadn't saved them, he realized. In truth, they had saved something within him, something he hadn't known was lost until he found it in them. Those 3 lives, connected by bonds no adversity could break, had shown him what really mattered. And so he stayed. One Sunday, much like any other, sitting on the floor of a small apartment with coffee in a simple glass cup and crumbs